Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's panel on innovation and how technology can increase access to healthcare. And we're very fortunate to have two of the leading NGO CEOs to talk with us about how technology is leapfrogging in the fields of malaria and TB. And of course, they'll have a lot to say about that. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about each of our panelists. We welcome Martin Edlund here. Martin was trained as a journalist, having worked at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New Republic and other such places, who became a development leader. He now and has been at Malaria No More for, I think, almost a decade. He has been CEO for several years, and we welcome him. Malaria, as Martin will tell you, is the world's oldest and deadliest disease. But our second guest, Dr. Melvin Spigelman, who heads up the TB Alliance, who comes to the TB Alliance with a rather distinguished career, having been a head of research at a pharmaceutical company and Knoll Pharma. And he's an oncologist, physician by training, but he heads up the TB Alliance. And Mel says that actually he believes that TB may be the world's oldest disease. We'll let them duke that out at some of the time, but today we're going to be talking about how technology and innovation can increase healthcare access. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Good. Why don't we just sort of begin with each of you describing just your work briefly so that everyone knows what you do, and then that'll get us into the discussion. Martin, you go first.
Thanks, Robert. Great to be with you and with Mel, and thanks very much to PQMD for putting this panel together. It's such an important topic and an important time for all the things that we care about working in global health. So, you know, sometimes I trip over explaining Malaria No More because the name kind of says it all. We were founded at the White House Summit on Malaria back in 2006 with the goal of helping to catalyze the investments, the innovation, the networks that could end what I will contend is the world's oldest, deadliest disease in our lifetimes. And the good news is we're making tremendous progress. After 15 years of investment in innovation, we've seen 7.6 million lives saved, 1.5 billion malaria cases averted, and trillions of dollars in economic benefits unlocked for malaria-affected countries. And so Malaria No More's work focuses kind of on the high end of that, the top of the ecosystem in mobilizing political will and resources, and then the very local end, demonstrating innovations that can scale and transform outcomes. And so we have teams in the US, the UK, Japan, in several places in India, and then we've actually developed and spun out a series of partner organizations across sub-Saharan Africa. So great to be with you.
Thank you, Melvin. Martin, I'm sorry. Mel, why don't you talk a little bit about the TB Alliance, give an introduction to your organization and what you do.
Great, thank you. And again, I really want to thank organizers for putting this together. It really is so critical a topic. The TB Alliance was founded at the end of the year 2000 because of the recognition that TB was really just getting even more and more out of control, and there really weren't anywhere near the resources or the devotion of development of innovation to really curb the spread of TB. You know, there were more deaths from TB until last year of any other infectious disease per year, until unfortunately COVID got that claim to having more deaths than TB. So there was minimal work going on, and at a meeting of well over 100 organizations in South Africa, one of the conclusions was to form an organization called the TB Alliance, which would be dedicated to actually discovering, developing, and delivering new TB therapies, as there had not been really any significant new TB therapy for decades before that. We went from having a portfolio of zero employees to now having the largest pipeline for new TB drugs in history, and having introduced new TB therapies for pediatric TB, which afflicts over 1 million kids every year, and to a year and a half ago, introducing and getting approved by the FDA and subsequent EMA in other countries, a dramatically improved therapy for highly drug-resistant TB. We partner with a whole variety of pharmaceutical companies around the world, all the major ones practically over the years, and now with a large variety of generic companies with whom we commercialize the products. But we still have only scratched the surface of what needs to be done. I think one could look at us as a not-for-profit biotech company almost, in a whole new space that I think has only gained real popularity over the last decade or so.
Thank you. Thank you both for telling us about your organization and how exciting the work is. It's hard to start any conversation about health today without beginning with what we're experiencing now with COVID-19. A lot of attention on COVID-19, lots of innovation as a result of COVID-19. And you almost feel as if everything else is being sort of put aside and forgotten. I know that isn't true, and both of you are going to tell me why that isn't true, but that's what it feels like. So I want you to maybe sort of talk to our audience today about sort of in the midst of COVID-19, what's happening in the areas that you're working in. Mel?
Yeah, you know, none of us can deny the importance and the critical nature of COVID-19, but realistically, it has taken a large toll on at least the TB arena around the world. We just had a big meeting yesterday, actually, to go through what can we do about it amongst the whole number of leaders in the tuberculosis and other space around the world, because it is a major problem. I think just the estimates are that it's set back TB control and progress probably by 5 to 10 years. And there are the estimates of how many more TB people will die from TB because of what's happened in our clinical trials. For example, TB hospitals have been closed down to convert them to COVID hospitals. Funding has certainly dried up to a certain extent, or to a great extent, because of the economic situation and because of the need for a huge amount of effort, which has gone into, rightfully so, into the COVID pandemic. On the other hand, on the brighter side, it's caused more innovation, especially in the healthcare delivery space, for what has had to be done in the world of TB because of the limitations based on lockdowns, et cetera, and we can get into that. So it has definitely had a huge impact. And we are working, everybody, I'm sure, both not only in the TB field but in other fields, is working unbelievably hard to minimize those impacts. And even hopefully, when all is said and done, to come out of this much stronger than how we all have gone into it. I think one of the things, though, that COVID has highlighted is that if we want to make progress in terms of access and medical care, innovation is critical. And I don't think anybody can deny that that is one of the lessons of the COVID pandemic.
Okay, I'm going to come back to how innovations in TB care have arisen as a result of COVID, but I want to go to Martin to talk a little bit about how he sees the impact of COVID and what impact it's had on the work he's done in malaria.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And many parallels to what Mel described. You know, it was last April, just as the true scope and scale of COVID was becoming clear, that the WHO did some modeling, and they actually predicted that we could have seen a doubling of deaths from malaria, the undoing of 15 years of progress in a single rainy season due to disruptions from COVID. You know, in many parts of the world, the battle against COVID and the battle against malaria are indistinguishable. 7 of 10 are the same, starting with fever. And so, you know, for a country to try to even identify COVID cases, they need to have strong systems for identifying malaria. There was also a real risk that it would disrupt some of the campaigns that are so essential to malaria progress, BedNet campaigns, some screen and treat campaigns, some of the spraying campaigns, which are a part of the arsenal and the effort. The good news is, through massive coordination, leadership by groups like the US President's Malaria Initiative, we were able to keep many of those campaigns on track. So last year, more than 200 million long-lasting insecticide-treated mosquito nets were delivered across the malaria-affected world. We have seen some pretty troubling numbers in terms of disruption to testing and treatment seeking. The Global Fund estimates about a 31% decline in malaria diagnosis between April and September of last year, as opposed to the previous year. So certainly some concerns, but I think we've been able to mitigate some of those efforts. You know, it has energized elements of the fight as well. You know, one of the areas of focus for malaria, it's a disease of the rural poor, and so you need to always be extending frontline health systems, health workers, and even in the private sector. You know, and particularly when you look through the lens of COVID and pandemics, you know, we've realized that the hot spots for malaria transmission tend to be these rural, forested, remote communities, which are also the blind spots for the spillover of new zoonotic diseases. We published a report, Malaria No More, the UN Foundation, and our partners in the UK, called Leave No Fever Undiagnosed. And we looked at countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Mozambique, a number in Southeast Asia, who had actually had invested with the help of PMI and the Global Fund in frontline health worker networks. And they were able to retrain and adapt those networks to the COVID fight. And they've been some of the most successful in stemming the effects of COVID. So we're seeing in interesting ways that investing in the platforms and capabilities to end malaria may actually be key to defeating COVID and preparing for the next pandemic.
What gives you hope and reason to believe that actually the innovations that have occurred during COVID can be highly contributory to what you're doing in malaria?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, finding hope in a moment like this is not an easy thing to do. Not to be flip at all, but you know, we need to make sure we don't waste a pandemic, that we learn lessons, that we adapt, that we build back better. You know, one of the things we've been working on at Malaria No More is a project we call Forecasting Healthy Futures. We're working with a number of great partners internationally, groups like Tableau and IBM's The Weather Company, Path, and other partners. And we're digging in at the community level and getting hyper-local epi data, service delivery data. We're combining that now with weather data. And we're finding when you have those kind of data sets at your fingertips, you can really distinguish what are kind of natural fluctuations in the presence of fevers and malaria from kind of emergent areas of concern. So that's something that's encouraging to us. You know, going from the hyper local to kind of the global and technology. Also seeing that the world has demonstrated a new capacity to quickly develop vaccines for COVID. You know, what's been accomplished from an R&D and manufacture standpoint has been nothing short of astonishing. And, you know, frankly, we've been stuck in the malaria campaign. We haven't been able to develop vaccines with the speed or the efficacy that we'd want. But we're actually finding that some of the players that maybe refined their strategies or innovated around RNA vaccine approaches are now able to make progress on the malaria side. We actually saw a report published last Friday in The Lancet about a really exciting new malaria vaccine. It's called R21. It's the results were from the phase 2B trial. And so this is the Jenner Institute at Oxford, the Serum Institute in India, the same partners who came together to develop the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine are now reporting a candidate vaccine for malaria that's 77% effective in children who are the most vulnerable group. That's more than twice the efficacy of the current kind of best-in-class malaria vaccine. So something like that could be truly transformative. And as surprising as it sounds, we could come out of this with more tools and better equipped to end a disease like malaria.
Well, that's really good news. We've certainly moved well ahead of chloroquine. Let me go back to Mel. Mel, I wanted to ask you about you at the end of the last question. You said the one thing we've discovered is the need for innovations and how innovations have changed. Tell me about some of the innovations that you've seen that you've been forced to come up with because of what we've have experienced this past year.
So let me go back a step and maybe correct that. I think we have known always that the major advances come on the back of innovation. And I guess simply put, I would say innovation is a necessary but not sufficient component of really dramatically increasing medical care and equity in medical care, et cetera. So it's necessary but not sufficient. And I think we've known that for years and years. What we've seen in the last year is that if you increase the resources to make them reasonable, that goes into generating innovation, that has a huge effect on how rapid and how effective the innovation that's discovered can be. That, I think, is the major lesson that hopefully will be learned, that you cannot do innovation on a total shoestring the way, frankly, it's been done in the so-called neglected tropical diseases such as malaria and TB. So that's been the reinforced message. But even on the shoestring that's been done in the last, or the advances that we've been fortunate enough to be a part of in the last 5 years, let me just pick out two. One is in the field of pediatric TB. Like I said, pediatric TB affects about 1 million kids a year around the world. And it can be drastic. Until a few years ago, the way that pediatric TB was treated was you took adult pills and you had to either crush them, cut them up, they taste horribly, et cetera, and then try to mask the taste and get the appropriate dose in whatever vehicle, applesauce or whatever. And for a minimum of 6 months, up to 2 years, try to do this daily for a child or a baby and get them to take a medication that tasted horribly and was probably the wrong dose. That was the state of the art until about 2016 or 2017, believe it or not, for 1 million kids around the world. And at that point, we were fortunate to team up with, at that point, McLeod's was the main company that we worked with, to forge a state-of-the-art pediatric formulation for the major drugs for drug-sensitive TB, at least, where now there's one pill, you can drop it into a little glass of water, it dissolves, tastes like strawberries or, tastes fine, is the exact right dose for kids, depending on their size, how many pills you put in the water, and is now available in well over 100 countries around the world. It's so simple, but it took resources, planning, et cetera. Yeah. And then a couple of years ago in the field of drug-resistant TB in adults, which had a mortality rate or a success rate of about 20% with treatment for 2 years or more, injectables every day for months and months. It's just horrible treatment, horrible results. And through a series of events, which I won't go through, now have approved a 3-drug regimen, cutting down the treatment duration from 2 years to 6 months, increasing cure rates from 20% to 90%. It's cheaper, easier to take, etc., in addition to all those benefits. That's the power of innovation.
Well, hearing that, and yes, you're absolutely right, for both of you, with these sort of new tools that you have in the areas in which you work, the big issue always has been, how do we get them delivered to populations? What are the barriers to getting them? Will these new tools you have be easier to get to populations? I'd just like both of you to actually comment on that. Martin, you go first.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And different, as Mel says, having the tools and having the innovation is a necessary but not sufficient condition. One of the other conditions you need is the resources. And before you can deliver them, you need to develop them, you need to purchase them, you need to distribute them to countries. And this COVID crisis is coming at a moment where we're seeing global resources for infectious disease contract, actually. And there's a real risk that that's going to worsen in the years ahead. Developed world economies have spent over $15 trillion in their own domestic relief efforts in the context of COVID. African countries in sub-Saharan Africa had about $100 billion in additional expenses due to COVID. And there are also a number of countries facing severe kind of debt service payments and so forth. So the resources the world has at its disposal are shrinking. This is a moment where we need leadership, where we need countries to step up and say, you know what, if this past year has taught us anything, it's taught us how foundational health is to our safety, to our education, to our families, to our prosperity. And so we need to invest in these things. It's one of the reasons it was great to see from the Biden administration on President Biden's first full day in office, National Security Directive 1, which said the U.S. is going to engage, the U.S. is going to lead on this crisis as it's done in the past. And so it's a moment, it's really a gut check moment where the world needs to step up and invest in these solutions once they're developed, making sure that they're distributed to the field. The one final thing I'd say is I think it's also a moment for us to think in innovative ways about financing. Malaria No More has been doing some work with partners on innovative financing solutions. How can we crowd in private capital to solve some of these challenges? Working with PMI, the USDFC, Rockefeller and Skoll Foundations, we did a loan guarantee facility to actually provide working capital and prop up frontline health clinics across 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa who were severely distressed by COVID and disruption of services and patient flow. And so those are the kind of creative solutions, in addition to the political commitment, that we need to weather this and come out stronger.
It's the issue of resources, particularly in a time where so much of our national will in certainly Western countries, and I would imagine in many other countries around the world, is devoted to trying to fight COVID. What's happening in India is very disturbing today. And I can't imagine what malaria and TB in India is going to require going forward. In fact, it is such a substantial disruption. I actually think you must have some plans about that. You must be thinking about what's going to happen in India. But I think the resource, the giant sucking sound of resources devoted to COVID will flatten some other areas of inquiry. It may not be that case for malaria or TB because you're so well established as older diseases deserving of a lot of attention. But I'd like to ask you Mel, what do you think is the sort of prognosis for additional resources for TB and particularly for the hotspots that are emerging around the world?
Yeah. So first of all, Robert, the COVID pandemic has tremendously negatively affected the resources that are going into TB. That I can tell you has dramatically decreased those.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it has had a negative impact. What we talked about earlier, it set the field back by years, certainly, if not a decade. But looking forward, and I think Martin alluded to this, it's now going to require a huge amount of education and through that political will. Because the real bottom line is there is no choice. if we don't redouble the efforts, and if we don't make health and universal health coverage and health equity a real priority on a global level for every country that's possible around the world, we're looking at disaster. And I think if there is a silver lining in any way to COVID, I hope it will have made that obvious to political leaders around the world, in addition to people living through it, that in fact we have no choice. We have to redouble the effort and the resources that will go into not only emerging pandemics that we don't know about yet, but the pandemics that we have already that have been around for God knows how long. And I think that's going to be what is really necessary. The resources are there. Let's not, confuse that. We can talk about a few bombers and a few, fighter planes and a few aircraft carriers, and we have way more than enough money to really take care of healthcare issues. So it's not that the resources aren't there. It's prioritization that really requires a relook.
And that would be true, you think, the world over?
I think that is the world over, yes.
Yeah, I thought you might feel that way. We only have a few more minutes, and in those few more minutes, I'm going to give each of you maybe a minute and a half just to talk about sort of, if you were a Cotty under a tree and could have anything you want, sort of apart from the resource issue, what's the innovation you'd like to see? What would you like to see, Martin, to advance your goal to end malaria in our lifetimes?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. It's rare that you get the opportunity to get anything you wish for. So I'd certainly want to ponder this answer a little more. But I think in the moment, what I would love to see is for the world to recognize some of the capacities and networks that we built in the malaria campaign, to invest in those as part of the response to COVID and the next pandemic. When you think about recent pandemic diseases, they're often acute febrile illnesses. We saw the same situation with Ebola in West Africa, where the symptoms were indistinguishable initially from malaria. And what we've built over the past 15 years is a cadre of health posts and frontline workers, private sector capacities to deliver malaria diagnosis, drugs, and to capture data.
Real infrastructure.
A real infrastructure that reaches the people in greatest need. And if we could lean into that infrastructure now, I think we could accelerate the world's response to COVID. I think we could build an early warning system for finding and fighting acute febrile illness and recognize the next pandemic before it explodes on the world scene.
Mel, when you shared with us earlier in the panel that you think TB Care has been, or at least some of the initiatives that you all had moving, has been set back by 5 or 10 years, that's actually rather alarming. I certainly did think there would be some pause, but I had no idea that the level of disruption that's occurred would have done this. How do you see coming out of this? How do we make up that time?
Oh God, great question. I wish I had an answer or a good answer to it. Clearly, we need to truly redouble the efforts. You can't get away from resources. If the resources aren't going to be there, both on the ground in terms of building the healthcare infrastructure and also in terms of generating innovation, we're doomed, to be very frank. So, I think if you abstract the issue of resources, though, then I think even the integration of healthcare systems, the parts of the fragmentation that exists in so many healthcare systems around the world that don't take advantage of what's there already in terms of real integration and really building on what exists in one field to expand that into others, etc. So we can still generate a lot more synergy with what we have, but without the added resources that are going to be needed, it won't be enough, that's for sure.
We have two very, very good questions posed by observers is one, Martin, I'm going to direct to you. It has to do with the implementation of malaria vaccines and whether or not you've seen an increase in vaccine hesitancy that hurts that effort. This for you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that question, Robert. You know, unfortunately, the malaria vaccine effort is so nascent that I don't think we probably have any data on vaccine hesitancy. You know, there is a pilot effort underway. There's the GSK RTSS vaccine is currently being piloted in Kenya, Ghana, and Malawi. And you know, not to minimize it at all, it's the first even partially effective vaccine against a parasite and a major breakthrough. But I know they're learning a lot on the front lines about kind of how you need to engage communities and how you need to educate about a vaccine, especially one that's partially effective, right? To tell people that once you get this vaccine, you still need to be vigilant about bed net use, testing fevers, etc. But so I'm sure there are many lessons, particularly in the context of COVID, that they're finding. We just don't have those results yet.
Okay, and just quickly, Mel, there's a question. Person would be interested to know if there are diseases with which you would team up to join forces to improve access to your treatments. Any other infectious diseases or even non-communicable diseases?
Yeah, so first, hello to Francois. I saw the question from Francois. But yes, the answer is we have already, and specifically what we've embarked upon in the last few years is in the field of the non-TB mycobacterial diseases. So for example, in the US, we've teamed up with actually the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, because in cystic fibrosis, two of the diseases that affect those patients afflicted with cystic fibrosis are Mycobacterium abscessus and Mycobacterium avium, for which there may be real activity in a lot of our libraries of compounds that hit the TB mycobacterial. Similarly, there are diseases in other parts of the world, such as leprosy, Buruli ulcer, etc., that also are from the same general family of mycobacteria, but for which we can potentially have synergy with the drugs that we are developing or that we've discovered. So we're always on the lookout for crosstalk or cross-efficacy between the projects that we work on specifically for TB and other infectious diseases. In the field of non-communicable diseases, the one area that we have gotten into just in the last 12, 24 months is the area of artificial intelligence and immunotherapeutics, where in those areas there certainly could be synergy between what we learn about the immune system and what we learn in general about artificial intelligence in terms of the earlier part of the discovery pipeline. So yes, that's a great question in an area that has tremendous potential.
Great. I'm going to have to let that be the last word. I'm told that our time is up. Obviously, we could go on with this conversation because there's been a lot of innovation. Thank you for sharing with us today, and I turn it back over to PQMD.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you very much.